Okay, we've got to talk about what's going on with our kids. Latest data from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare shows around 600,000 Australians of all ages are on ADHD medication. That's 2% of the population, and of course, a lot of those are children. The medication is used to help control their moods and behaviour, but what happens if that medication is suddenly unavailable? Well, that's the situation we find ourselves in right now. There's a national shortage of ADHD drugs and parents are concerned. Joining me now is child and adolescent psychologist Clare Rowe. Clare, thanks for coming on the program. Just before we get into what's happening and the implications, how many children rely on ADHD medication and how important is it?
Yeah, good evening, James. Look, in 2024, we know that nearly 300,000 Australian children were medicated on some type of psychostimulant or a medication specifically used for ADHD. But I think the most important figure is that that was an 18% increase from the year before, and that trend has been going on for the last decade. So these are medications that are being used increasingly at an exponential rate. And many families and children have come to rely on. So we estimate that about 6 to 10% of Australian children have ADHD, and about 6 to 7% of them are medicated. So in the entire child population, it's no small figure. There are a lot of families in panic mode, I would say, about the shortage. And we've seen other shortages of medications in previous years. Last year, there was a brand called Vyvanse that was short. This year, it's Ritalin. And this happens in the pharmaceutical industry from time to time. But I've already seen Facebook groups spring up where parents are commenting about which pharmacy they can get to and who has supply of it.
Well, I'm really curious about this because you mentioned so many parents now rely on this drug in order to, I'm not sure what the correct term is, but essentially moderate their child's mood. You can correct me if I've got that wrong. That sounds kind of dangerous to me, especially then when you can get a situation where those drugs are unavailable.
Yeah, so what we're doing is moderating or minimising, I suppose, the symptoms of ADHD, and they are mood, which is emotional regulation, but also, aggression, impulsivity, distractibility, concentration. Look, there are a lot of kids. ADHD is a very real disorder where medication is not just a nice to have. It's often the difference between being able to function socially and not. After saying that, I'm one of the professionals who have warned against an overdiagnosis of this condition and an over-reliance now on medication. I think it does bring up this point when we have a pharmaceutical shortage about how deeply some families come to believe that their child simply cannot function without a pill. And I think that raises other questions, and they are, what other supports are being put in place as well as medication, psychosocial supports, accommodations in the classroom, behavioural modifications, behavioural therapies, even things like sleep, diet, exercise. All those things need to be looked at with kids. Before or as well as medication. And so when we just have a reliance on medication and we have a shortage, this is showing it up in the panic that families are feeling.
All right, in the time we've got left, there's one other issue I wanted to ask you about, and that's children diagnosed with autism. Parents are divided over whether their autistic children require mainstream education or a specialised school. And while many parents want their children to be educated in real-world settings, a recent survey found 8 in 10 parents are actually concerned about the lack of support in mainstream schools. So they would appear to be caught in a contradiction. They want real-world setting, but they also want extra help. How do you reconcile those two issues?
Well, yeah, look, I have spoken out in recent weeks with some criticism about both the NDIS and what is termed the neuro-affirming movement that I think in some pockets has become quite radical. And I think herein lies the tension. I think parents of autistic children, of which I'd say the loudest voices at the table are the ones that require the least supports. They don't like the term mild autism. They get offended by that. I say that's highly offensive to a parent with a profoundly disabled child. But anyway, and I think on one hand, they want their kids in mainstream schools. The neuroaffirming movement would say that autism is a very natural and normal part of human development and is not a deficit. But on the other hand, they say that they want substantial government resources and support. So it's not just a niche issue, James. I think, this is costing federal taxpayers $5 billion a year in disability payments to schools. And let me be clear, that's not the NDIS. That's on top of, that's separate to the NDIS. This is funding going directly to schools to support a growing number of kids now who are labelled as disabled. So we need to have a look about where we place these kids, whether they are in specialised schools or whether a mainstream public school system can support them adequately.
You mentioned the $5 billion annually spent supporting kids with disabilities in our schools. You also mentioned the fact that more and more kids are being diagnosed with disabilities. This is a big issue. Do you see any way that it's going to be resolved, or is this just something we're going to live with from now on?
Well, I think it requires some honesty in my profession. As I said, I have had a huge amount of backlash for calling out in recent weeks fraudulent behaviour going on in the NDIS. I've had backlash from my own profession reporting me to regulatory bodies. So I think if we can't even have that conversation, we're in really murky waters. I think it does require resourcing and training within smaller classrooms and so forth. But also, I think specialised schools shouldn't have a stigma. And so for some families, it's not about exclusion. It's about the most compassionate and the most genuine environment that can help their kids thrive. And so I understand.
Yeah, Claire, you're absolutely right, Claire. You're absolutely right on that. I appreciate you filling us in this evening. Thanks so much.